My name is Tara Moore, and thank you for joining us for the Wildlife Connectivity and Habitat Corridors talk today. And the South Wake Conservationists are the ones who are sponsoring this great webinar tonight, putting this on and organized our speaker, Dr. Liz Rutledge. So I'm going to turn it right over to Chad Chandler, the president of the South Wake Conservationists.
Thank you, Tara. And thanks everyone that joined us today or tonight for this this webinar. Just wanted to mention that this is a South Wake Conservationist public meeting. We have two types of meetings: is the public, and then we have a chapter meeting. And we do this on alternate months. The public meetings are on the even number months, and the chapter meetings are on the odd numbers. But basically, the difference mainly is the public meetings. We have special guest speakers, which we're having tonight, of course, and then on the chapter meetings is mainly the members are invited, and also others that are show an interest in our chapter and have done volunteering with us, or actually anyone that would want to join that meeting. It's just the main difference is we just don't have a special guest speaker. And we do talk about planning and some business items with that chapter meeting. I wanted to mention a couple of items, kind of announcements that we've done since our last meeting a couple of months ago. We've done, pretty much been very much involved with the Trees for Trash program. We've been picking up trash along roads and creeks and lakes, and of course we're in canoes when we're doing the lakes. We've been planting quite a few trees and other pollinator plants at schools and parks and even along greenway trails. So just recently we had a meeting with an individual with the Raleigh Housing Authority. So we have some plans to plant some pollinator plants and some trees at some of the public housing communities in Raleigh. And we even talked about removing some invasive plants. So that's kind of in our plans ahead. Some of the more immediate events that we have coming up is, first of all, there's this Saturday, a few of us were invited to set up a booth at the Marbles Kid Museum that's in Raleigh. And they're having an event there. It's called Connecting with Nature. And we've kind of designed our own booth, and the theme of that is going to be, how does nature feel? So, 3 of us are going to be there from 12 o'clock until 3 p.m. So we were kind of excited to participate in that event. And then another event coming up on June the 19th, it'll be another cleanup, for the Trees or Trash. We're going to be cleaning up an area in Raleigh. I guess it's near a bridge in the Crabtree area. So it's on our website. You can check it out and sign up for that and register for that if you'd like to join us and help us out. Finally, if there's some of you out there that are interested in some plants that attract butterflies and other pollinators, we were happy to receive some of these from the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission. So we still have a few of those left, maybe about 10 or 12 butterfly weeds. We have this whirling milkweed, several of those. So if you're just wanted to put a few plants in the ground, contact, you can get on our website and go to just the general information link, and that'll come to one of us, and we can just arrange a time to pick up a few of those plants. That's pretty much it for the announcements, but now I wanted to kind of turn it over to John Kinsella. He's our Vice President, and he's going to be introducing our speaker for tonight.
Thanks, Chad. And it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Liz Rutledge. Dr. Rutledge is the Director of Wildlife Resources for the North Carolina Wildlife Federation, so she's kind of one of our own. She received her doctorate in fisheries, wildlife, and conservation biology, and she came to the Wildlife Federation in 2014. Dr. Rutledge has led a deer management program resulting in tens of thousands of pounds of venison that was donated to feed the hungry. She's also collaborated on work benefiting elk, coyotes, red wolves, white-tailed deer, alligators, and other species. In addition, she's a member of several prestigious wildlife commissions, and she's also a board member for the North Carolina Hunters for the Hungry program. So, without any further ado, I'd like to turn the program over to Dr. Rutledge.
All right, thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. This chapter has a lot of old friends, so I'm really excited. I was excited to get the invitation to come speak to you guys this evening. And we also are going to talk about a topic that I think is a lot of fun. It's educational, it's relevant, current to what's happening today, and just a lot of information to cover. So as you know, Southweight Conservationists, I was excited to hear everything this chapter is doing. The chapter is involved in the deer donation program, pollinator habitat work, all kinds of good stuff. So once again, great to see you guys, and we'll get started. So the topic of the presentation that I'm going to give tonight is connectivity saves lives. And when we talk about connectivity and saving lives, we're not just talking about people, but we're also talking about wildlife lives. And so just to get started, we're going to go through a little bit of general background on connectivity, habitat, impacts to wildlife, things like that. And then we're going to move into, toward the end, I'm going to talk about a couple projects that the Wildlife Federation is actually partnering on related to this topic. So we will get started here. And so some of you might ask, what is connectivity in terms of habitat? And so I thought this was a pretty good definition from California Department of Fish and Wildlife. So it covers some of the kind of key words that I would look for when I'm talking about connectivity. And I'll let you guys read the screen. But basically it's talking about organisms or natural processes moving unimpeded across habitats. So this can be terrestrial or aquatic, and so we're going to talk about both of those this evening as well. Natural and semi-natural components of the landscape. So there's a lot of natural components, and then we also have some human interactive when we talk about crossings, structures, things like that. So these items basically are used to connect enough habitat to meet species needs. And so that's what's most important, that we're making this kind of an area where species can traverse back and forth to fill all their requirements without, you know, extra risk of mortality, things like that. So, and here in this definition, it talks about without connectivity processes. It talks about nutrient flow, gene flow, seasonal migration, pollination, predator-prey relationships. So some of these relationships cannot occur without connectivity. And this evening's presentation, we're going to touch on gene flow, migration are going to be the two main ones that we're going to talk about this evening. So basically that last sentence is a great summary. Increasing connectivity is a critical strategy for addressing habitat loss and fragmentation. So basically our landscape is becoming more and more fragmented. We're losing habitat every day, and this is a threat to biodiversity. And with where we are right now, we're hearing a lot about climate change, biodiversity, how do we maintain species for the future? So this is a pretty critical topic to discuss at this time. All right, so we'll start out with really the general basics. So why do animals move? So the reasons they move are pretty just regular life necessities: food, water, to find a mate, looking for a different habitat type for a different reason, cover, den and nesting sites, and dispersal. So these are just their general functions that need to be fulfilled based on habitat type. And so you can see some of the pictures here. I was going with a squirrel theme, and then it was hard. It got harder and harder to find a squirrel nest, which, as many of you know, looks like just a big ball of leaves up in a tree. So then I branched out to some of the avian. So we've got a couple birds in here and some nests, and we've got a little rabbit nest there. So these are just some of the life functions of wildlife. And so we'll move on here to talk about human population growth. So population growth is a driving factor of fragmentation and habitat loss. And so here in the first bullet, I've got millions of miles of roads and infrastructure. So that's what we have across the landscape now. And as population growth continues, then we build more infrastructure. We have more roadways. So we've got to figure out a proactive way to coexist with wildlife on the landscape as population numbers continue as well. And so I've got roads underlined here in the sentence because part of the presentation, we're going to talk in general about connectivity, but a lot of it's going to be road mortality and wildlife. So human population growth, the more people we have, the more infrastructure, destroys habitat. And when you do this, you're also creating barriers for wildlife. And then so as a product of all of this and more infrastructure, with part of the focus tonight on roadways, you increase medical and property expenses, loss of life, and traffic delays. And a lot of that is due to wildlife vehicle collisions. And so that's going to be part of the focus off and on throughout the presentation. So I just wanted to give you a few facts from the North Carolina Department of Transportation and Safety Division. This was over a 3-year time period, and it's just to give you an idea about kind of what that looks like across the state. So more than 56,000 vehicle wildlife collisions over a 3-year time period. And as many of you know, the majority of these are going to be deer related. So 90%. This is a conservative estimate for human fatalities, human injuries, but 2,800 injuries, 5 human fatalities. We do know that not every wildlife vehicle collision gets reported. Approximately $157 million in property damage. Okay, so that's a lot of money. And I want you guys to kind of keep that in mind when we start talking about crossings and structures and the price, because in the long run, it's actually more economically feasible to incorporate structures into our infrastructure for long term. And I did want to say here, I put a little star at the bottom, various transportation systems impact wildlife. So I'm primarily talking about roadways and wildlife vehicle collisions, but we also have wildlife collisions with trains, airplanes. There's a lot of information out there, so it's not just related to roadways, but that's a large majority of it. And so I put this picture up here too, because I think this is a really cool picture and it kind of tells a little bit of a story. This is from a national park. And what you see here are wildlife doing what they do naturally, and us as people in the vehicles having to stop and wait for this experience. And so this is one of the few places where things like this occur, where wildlife are actually kind of dominating that landscape and what's happening. So I just think it's a really cool, informative picture. And so moving forward, navigating a patchwork landscape. So what we've got now across the landscape in general, especially in a lot of urban to suburban areas, we've got this patchwork of greenscape mixed in with a lot of development. And then we've got more rural areas that have a lot of forest and open fields, things like that. So I wanted to just show you guys a little bit on these pictures. We'll start with the large one. This is a US city, and you can see here this roadway is probably, when you add them all up, you're probably looking at 8 lanes or so across all of that. You've got barriers in between, and then you've got on the left-hand side, well, you've got some green space over in the residential area, and then on the other side, then you go into a parking lot. And so when we talk about animals being able to adapt to urban areas, there are some species that will be able to adapt more readily to this type of environment and some that do not. And if you were a deer in this landscape, you would have a pretty treacherous journey across there back and forth. And so not only does this patchwork landscape kind of promote risk for mortality to wildlife, it also pushes wildlife around. So if this is no longer a suitable habitat for a particular species, they're going to have to leave and go somewhere else. And that's kind of also what you see in the picture on the bottom. So when you're looking at clear cutting or deforestation, you're going to be moving a lot of species around that were adapted and accustomed to that habitat, and they live there, were able to thrive, survive, and whatnot. And then you have kind of clear cutting, you have forests being removed, you have infrastructure being put in, and they have to either move to a new area or they don't survive the clear cutting. It just depends on the species. And then up here at the top, I've just got an example of kind of what we think of as a common dam structure, and that would be common for North Carolina per se. And so when we end up damming up rivers and stream areas, we change that landscape for wildlife. And so this could cause obstructions for some aquatic species that maybe need to go upstream for some reason. And so it's just another example of trying to navigate a patchwork landscape. So talk a little bit about wildlife impacted. So in my opinion, there aren't really any species that I could pretty well think of that aren't impacted in one form or another when we talk about population growth, when we talk about barriers, when we talk about connectivity and fragmentation and what connectivity means to these species. So I wanted to put a combination here. So we've got obviously black bears. So we've got a large species that's going to have a larger home range that's moving across the landscape. We've got some monarch caterpillars here. So a lot of times when we think about wildlife, we don't necessarily think about the insects and stuff, but they are also migrating. They're also utilizing resources. We've got reptiles, amphibians, aquatic down there in the middle. And then we've got some of these, what I would consider like mesopredators and stuff, which are kind of like middle-sized predators that are on the landscape. So raccoons, foxes, you could have coyotes, anything in that range. So basically all wildlife can be impacted by fragmentation. And so along with that, you want to talk about scale when you talk about wildlife and you talk about movement. So the amount and type of suitable contiguous habitat for resource requirements. And what that means is basically not all habitat is equal. You can have a vast amount of habitat that is not suitable for particular species. And then you can have small patches of habitat that are unique and very desirable, which promote biodiversity. And so basically, when you talk about scale and movement, the movement of wildlife can vary by scale, and then it also can vary temporally, which means so animals could have different movements daily or seasonally or over longer extended periods of time. And so these are things that we want to account for when we talk about connectivity. And so I want to take it one step further and just talk a little bit about some other variables that kind of affect wildlife movement. So down here, the picture, we've got basically a little mouse. And so when we talk about the home range of a mouse, which it looks like this little guy is gathering some lunch or something. So basically finding all the resources that they need within a small area. And so that would potentially be their home range size. And so the home range size of a mouse versus a home range size of an elk or caribou, a migrating species, is going to be much, much different. And so the middle picture too, I wanted to put that in there because I thought that was a great example of an urban area. So there are some species that can live their whole entire lives in this green space and find all the resources that they need. And then there are going to be a lot of species that could never survive here. So when you talk about scale, you want to talk about, well, what wildlife species are we trying to provide connectivity for, and what does that look like? And so we can also talk a little bit about variation between gender, age, and individuals. So depending on gender, so males and females have different home range sizes. So deer, for example, bucks at different parts of the year are going to be moving further than females. And then we also have age. So if you have a juvenile and an adult, a reproductive adult and a juvenile may be moving different amounts to different locations. And so that can vary. It can also vary by individual. Sometimes even within species, you'll find individuals that are much more wary than other individuals or much more present. So you may at your home see some of the same wildlife that you see over and over again, and then you occasionally may see something different that's just traveling through. And so another variable to consider is also dispersal in territory. So sometimes juveniles are raised, they grow up, and it's time for them to disperse and find their own new territory and place where they're going to mate. And so they're going to be moving at different times of their lives. So that just gives you a basic idea of what scale is based on movement. And so we'll talk just a few minutes about available suitable habitat. And once again, not all available habitat necessarily means it's suitable for specific species. So what I've got here is growth of animal populations can be dependent upon or limited by the amount of available suitable habitat. So basically, the growth of some populations are limited based on what they can access habitat-wise. And so the second part here, loss of small patches can greatly influence a species' ability to fulfill its biological needs and survive. So there could be small patches of what we talked about, that unique habitat, unique structure, high biodiversity. So there's some species that could thrive off of a small area, but if that area doesn't exist, it's not going to fulfill their needs. And one thing we talk a lot about now, especially in North Carolina, and from the Wildlife Federation standpoint, we've been working on Recovering America's Wildlife Act, which is policy that would hopefully keep species common as opposed to threatened and endangered. And right here, I've just got a statement: threatened and endangered species may rely on specific attributes of habitat to fulfill processes. And so these populations are unlikely to increase in number unless they have suitable habitat or unless the quality of the habitat is improved. So that's really important to know. You could have habitat and it maybe just needs improvements for a species to begin to thrive, or it may need a much broader scale of habitat. And then on the bottom, I've got fire-dependent species. So a great example of this, longleaf pine. So a lot of those species in that ecosystem are fire-dependent species. And when we talk about plant species or animals, the animals are going to be adapted to the plants, and the plants may be fire-dependent. And so this could be, typically it was a naturally occurring process with lightning on the landscape would start fires years ago. The burning would promote the species growth. In today's world, we do a lot of management-induced practices of prescribed fire, and that can create suitable habitat for specific species. And so I wanted to put this map on here because it's really, really cool. And so Wildlands Network has done a tremendous amount of work, not just showing where habitat could potentially be available to connect pieces to make corridors for wildlife to move, but they look at what would be suitable, good habitat and what we can do. So this is called the Eastern Wildway. And I know that you guys have had Dr. Ron Sutherland talk to you guys before, and he's fantastic. But this is some of their work, just mapping out what these corridors would potentially look like up the East Coast, and how important it is to have some of these, especially for larger species or any type of migration. So it's just a really cool picture there. And so I want to take a minute and just talk about barriers to wildlife movement. Barriers can be natural or man-made, and I've got a couple pictures here. So that one is just purely a mountain range. There are some wildlife species that are not across the mountain range, and so that could be considered a barrier. And then, of course, I've got the picture here again of the dam, which would be a man-made structure that is considered a barrier. And then it can be aquatic or terrestrial, like we talked about before. And then I wanted to put a couple pictures up here, though, to talk about, we talk about barriers to movement. Barriers are, most of the time, we're talking about connectivity and bringing habitat together for wildlife to move. But at the same time, there are a few cases and examples where it's not always bad. And one picture here, other than the risk for mortality, sometimes animals will use the sides of roadways for movement, which, you don't want to increase your risk of mortality, but sometimes they use it as a way to get from one place to the next. And then riparian areas. So I've got a picture here of a river stream area. So a lot of times these become like traffic pathways for animals. And then we also could have an example of if you have a dam, so you have an aquatic species and a structure, and you may have a dam that separates an invasive species from a native species. So in some cases, it's not always bad. So I don't want to get it in your head that every single barrier to wildlife movement is a negative thing, because that's not always the case. The majority of the time, our roadways do cause negative impacts, but not always. So since we're on this topic, we'll talk about impacts to wildlife. So when you do have barriers, you run the risk of isolating populations. So you could have one species that is separated by a barrier that's large enough to prevent genetic flow between populations. And then when you have that over time, you have reproduction of these two almost subpopulations. And so that can change the subpopulations over time, which is kind of an interesting concept. And so in a lot of populations, you want as much gene flow as you can, especially with threatened and endangered species, because you're trying to increase the amount of genetic material available. And so there's also the inability to recruit or disperse. So that can be an impact to wildlife. If there are barriers and populations are not able to recruit individuals or have individuals that disperse to new territories, it could limit their expansion. And then you could possibly, in some cases, this is not in every case, but increase chance for extinction. So that could be genetics or weather events. And we talked a little bit about the genetics. If you have a population that has lack of genetic flow, and you have something like a weather event, like a flooding event or a hurricane or something like that, you could essentially, if the population is small enough, you could essentially have a whole population wiped out. And so that's something that we're always thinking about with species, about how to create enough habitat and have enough population to prevent one of these events from driving a species to extinction. And then we also, we have the loss of wildlife from road mortality, and I'm going to talk a lot more about that through the rest of the presentation. And so here we go, roads as barriers. So a lot of times we think about roads as a physical barrier. It's something that the wildlife animals have to cross to get to the other side. But a lot of times we don't think about it being a noise barrier. So anytime that you're creating a certain amount of noise with vehicles and traffic, there's a lot of wildlife that are going to become very wary of crossing a road based on the noise. And so when we talk about roads as barriers and we talk about traffic, we talk about the time of day of traffic, the amount of noise, the amount of traffic, width of the road can be a lot more difficult for wildlife to cross a 4-lane road with a 4-foot concrete barrier in the middle than a small 2-lane road in a forested area. Vegetation, sometimes depending on what type of vegetation is between roadways or on the sides of roadways, can attract animals to the road. And so that's not necessarily, you can use it as a way to deter wildlife away from the roads by planting vegetation in certain areas, but you don't want to create an attractant in the middle of a roadway for wildlife. And then we talk about guardrails. Guardrails can just be exactly that, a physical barrier in the middle of roads or on the side of roads. And so to wildlife, what is the importance here? For them, it's what's on the other side. There's something that's driving them to cross the road. There's a reason why they want to get to the other side. And it's either one of those things that we talked about, food, cover, a mate. It's part of their home range. It's part of their territory. It existed before the road existed, or there's some reason. Dispersal could be another example. And so all of these variables combined determine, one, if an animal crosses a roadway, and then also when an animal crosses. So there may be some species that are going to be more prone to cross at night, and there's going to be less traffic. You could have some nocturnal species or something like that. And then determining where animals cross, because barriers can kind of funnel animals to certain areas for crossing. And so we'll look at a couple of these. So once again, we have some fantastic partners, Wildlands Network and National Parks Conservation Association. The North Carolina Wildlife Federation is working with both of these groups on a connectivity project in the western part of the state. And so I'll talk about that in a little bit. But so I borrowed some of their pictures that I think tell a really cool story. So right here, we've got a coyote. This is in the western part of the state. And so this picture gives you the opportunity to say, what is going through this coyote's mind right now? And I mean, it could be a lot of different things. You think, okay, is he or she looking at traffic? Are they thinking about the barrier? Are they thinking about just what's on the other side? Or did they just pop out of the woods and think, I'll check this out? Are they looking for a rabbit, whatnot? It kind of tells its own story. But the reality is we have animals that are constantly on the sides of roadways, and we may not even notice them when we're driving by, but this is a great example. And so then we kind of want to talk about quantifying wildlife mortality. So when we quantify it, we're talking about numbers. How do we get a good idea, a grasp of what's happening on the landscape? So we know that millions of animals are killed every year on roadways. And these estimates mortality is underestimated for a few different reasons. And carcasses may be difficult to count, especially in remote areas. You may have roadways that people don't travel that often, but you could have wildlife that does happen to get hit on those roadways that would not be reported. You also have scavengers. We have a lot of species, especially in North Carolina. One of the things you see almost immediately are vultures. And so you do have scavengers that are going to feed off of carcasses from wildlife, roadway mortality, things like that. So you may not have a carcass there to count due to scavengers. And individuals, sometimes when an animal is hit by a vehicle and they make it a certain distance away from the road, and that's where they succumb. And then reptiles and amphibians, turtles, salamanders, frogs, things like that. A lot of times there's not a lot left to detect there. And so sometimes it's very difficult to quantify wildlife mortality. And so when research is occurring, you have to take all of this into account of how are we quantifying this to know exactly what the problem is, how bad the problem is, and where it's occurring. And I do want to make it a point, there are a lot of presentations, there's a lot of work out there. I was trying to stay away from some of the more emotionally driven photos that can go with some of these issues. So I've just left it very simple, but there's a lot of information available online about some of those stories and what that looks like. So I wanted to give you guys an idea here. This is from 2018, but it's kind of relevant. We're all close to, or a lot of us are close to the Wake County area. So I just wanted to show this. And these are animal crash locations over 1 year. And down at the bottom, you can see total crashes plotted. So we're looking right here at 389. And then it's divided out into quarters. So you've got Q1, 2, 3, and 4, and those correspond with different times of the year. And so just what I want you to note here, one, this is an extremely urban area. So if we go back to our thought process that 90% of wildlife vehicle collisions are typically deer. So we have a lot of deer in the area. So that means that deer are able to thrive in urban, suburban areas. And here we have it broken down by quarter, and I just want to note the red on the map. So that's October through December. So with deer, a lot of times, you know, that's the rut. So you're going to have a lot more movement. And so sometimes you can have a species that behaviorally, their behavior changes their movements throughout the year. And so you could have a higher rate of mortality during a certain season just based on the behavior of the species. So I think it's important to note that all species are different. And this information is available to anyone and everyone on the DOT website. So you can look up any county of the state. So I want to talk a little bit about what is a mortality hotspot. So when we start talking about wildlife crossing roadways and being part of wildlife vehicle mortality, so where is this happening? Animals are more inclined to follow the natural flow of the landscape. And so especially in, let's say, the western part of the state, topography tells a lot of the story about some of our larger species, black bear, elk, deer. They're going to be following these parts of the landscape. So this also includes riparian areas. So a lot of animals are going to follow rivers and streams. And so these can be natural barriers, man-made barriers. We kind of went over this, and they can kind of funnel animals into particular areas where they're more prone to cross a roadway. So mortality hotspots can be identified through research and monitoring. So you can actually monitor animal movements over time and basically build a picture of what's happening on the landscape, how they're moving, where they're moving, when this is occurring. Even some technology now can tell you what time of day, everything like that. So you could have GPS that gives you a fix every hour or something, depending on what you're monitoring. And so that kind of builds this picture of what's going on. And one thing I do want to note that sometimes I think we lose sight of, especially in research. So if you have an individual that, let's say, has a GPS collar or something, you've got a reproductive female who's older. You may also have young that are traveling with an adult. And so anytime you have barriers, you could have barriers that are more difficult for young juvenile to get across than adults. And when you lose those juvenile offspring or a reproductive adult, that can be very detrimental to a population, especially if they're struggling to maintain their population numbers anyway. So you always want to be cognizant of not just the behavior of the species, but what is their reproductive cycle like? Is there a chance that a mother bear may have a couple cubs with her, things like that? And so I wanted to give you guys just an example. Once again, this is a picture that Wildlands and National Parks Conservation Association put together for one of their presentations, but I think it kind of gives you a good idea. This is an elk that was collared. And so in the top portion, you can kind of see these continual movements over time with the red, where this elk is moving back and forth across the landscape, crossing a couple roads, going, it looks like southwest and kind of back here and there. And then you can kind of see the elk movement with a little bit of the topography. And so that elk is kind of coming down through the valley area. And unfortunately, this is an animal that did succumb to a wildlife vehicle collision. but it was being tracked by GPS at the time. And so we hate to see this individual as a mortality, but it does provide a lot of information that this animal happened to have a GPS unit on it. And so this is very valuable for us and, you know, these partners to make a difference in the, we know where some of these animals are moving. And we'll go to the next slide. So we'll talk then a little bit about corridors and connectivity. Now we kind of know how some species are moving across the landscape. So how do these corridor systems, connectivity of habitat, promote safe wildlife movement? So you can think of these, the connectivity, especially corridors, as kind of like sidewalks or what we think of are greenways, where we can go on foot through an area from one location to another. So basically, corridors allow wildlife to move from one location to another without a risk or threat of, you know, wildlife mortality, and they're able to gather the resources that they need. So it's kind of, it's an interesting, complex issue. But so with corridors and connectivity, once again, we go back to this can prevent genetic isolation and mortality if you can connect large contiguous areas of habitat that are not crossing roadways, or if you have a crossing structure. And so we talked again about small numbers, small populations that may require specialized habitat that are more susceptible to extinction if they're restricted to small areas. So now we'll talk a little bit about, now that we know about connectivity, we'll talk about crossing structures, because you could have two large areas of natural landscape, but you do have a roadway through the middle. So then we think, okay, so do we know where the wildlife are moving? And once we can find out where they're moving and how they're moving, then we can say, okay, is this an appropriate place for a crossing structure? And crossing structures come in different shapes and sizes. And I think that these are all absolutely fascinating. And I encourage you to go online and look at different crossing structures because it's really cool. So we have culverts and tunnels, overpasses, underpasses, naturally occurring land bridges. So some of these are actually naturally occurring. A lot of these are going to be man-made, overpasses, underpasses, culverts, tunnels, all man-made. Some of them are aquatic, some are terrestrial, some are a combination of the two. A lot of times it's best to go with natural substrates, which we'll look at a couple pictures of crossing structures and you'll see the natural substrate. A lot of times wildlife are more comfortable walking along something that they're familiar with. And then when we talk about, we can't talk about crossing structures without talking about fencing. So fencing goes hand in hand with these structures, because once you have a structure in place, for most species, especially obviously terrestrial, you're going to want to funnel them to the crossing structure. So you don't want mortality events occurring 30 yards down the road from where you have a crossing structure. So it's better to funnel them. And so these are more successful typically when you have adjacent lands that are either natural or protected, things like that, so that wildlife can move from one contiguous area to another. And so in the picture here, some of you may be familiar with this. So this is the crossing for flying squirrels in Western North Carolina. So you can watch the YouTube videos online and you can see the squirrels running and taking off and jumping to the other crossing structure. So it's just one example of a neat idea about how to maintain connectivity for a species. Reptile and amphibian. Nowadays, you can look it up. You can see some crossing structures. They almost look like grates across the road, but a lot of times those are actually crossing structures for salamanders, frogs, things like that. So it's really neat. And I encourage you guys to look up Christmas Island and the red crabs and just check out those crossing structures. So we're familiar with more things in this country in the US, but this is an issue that is not unique to North Carolina. It's not unique to the United States. There are crossing structures in different parts of the world, different countries. And so if you want to see some really cool stuff, just Google crossing structures. And so I'm going to show you some here. These are all pictures courtesy of Terry McGuire, who has a wealth of decades of experience of working with implementing crossing structures for wildlife. And so he was gracious enough to share some of these with us, because I asked him, I was like, I'd like to show him a couple pictures of some of the projects in Banff, which is in Canada, just to show you guys a little bit of what different structures can look like. And so here you can see there are different substrates, different designs. Some of them are going across divided roads. Some of them are going across like single, where there are bridges. The one in the corner almost looks like possibly during the rainy season, it possibly has water flow, things like that. So these are just a few cool examples. The one that where the same picture where Terry's name is actually in the picture, you can see the vegetation across the top of that crossing structure. So that provides cover and everything too for some of these species who are used to having cover. And so they can navigate through there, and to them it feels very natural. We've got the one on the bottom in the middle, very open. So depending on the species that you're kind of working with or trying to get from one side of the road to the other, some of them have different preferences based on different behaviors. So we'll kind of look at that too. So this is another picture from Wildlands and National Parks Conservation Association. This is from Western North Carolina, but it's our typical black bear, and he or she is checking out a culvert. So chances are the bears are utilizing these to cross under roadways. So I just think it's a really cool example. And then this was what I was talking about a little bit about kind of choosing your crossing structure based on the species that you're working with. So first of all, there's no silver bullet. No one solution fits all. So you can have a crossing structure that is built for a larger terrestrial species that then will also accommodate smaller mammals, different species underneath. But sometimes, so the example I'm going to talk about here is elk versus black bear. So I showed you guys this picture. So this bear is more than likely utilizing this culvert. So this is not a culvert that an elk is likely to use. And a lot of that depends on their behavior and what they feel comfortable with. So one, size makes a big difference, and the amount of light visibility makes a difference for some species. So I don't want you guys to focus too much on this chart, but it gives you an idea of just kind of all the different preferences. So across the top, we've got different types of crossing structures, different types of designs, and then down the side, we've got different wildlife species. So it's broken up here by ungulates and carnivores, which is not that important for what we're looking at. But this is just kind of like, okay, so if we're in Western North Carolina and we want to figure out what crossing structure is most comfortable for elk. So there are tables and things that we can look at to say, okay, an elk would feel most comfortable with an overpass with natural substrate, or, these are just hypothetical. So, but what's important to note is that it does vary by species and by behavior. So I think this is a great photo. This is from Wildlife Resources Commission, and this is part of a project I'm going to talk to you guys just a little bit about in the eastern part of the state. But I feel like this kind of sums up a lot of the message that we've been talking about here. So not only do we have a bobcat here, which I love this photo too, because this bobcat, you can just look at him or her and know exactly that they're going somewhere. They have a reason. I mean, this animal is very motivated, just very on a mission. And so I think this is a really cool photo though, because this shows aquatic and terrestrial. So there's obviously aquatic species could move back and forth behind the bobcat. And then you've got kind of this benching area of dry land where this bobcat is able to travel under the roadway. So I think this is a fantastic example of a combination for different species. So you could actually have turtles and stuff living under this roadway regularly, moving back and forth underneath. And then you're also helping species like bobcat. I would imagine, you know, coyotes, things like that are probably also utilizing it. But it's a really cool photo. And so when we start talking about all these different crossing structures and what that means and stuff, of course, transportation planning. So you want to be as proactive as possible. And that's where things are headed these days, being more proactive in the transportation planning process. So incorporating these crossings into the initial design. You can go back and kind of rehab roadways or bridges and add crossing structures. And of course, that's better than no crossing structure. But if you can get these into the initial planning process and you're able to utilize especially state or federal funding to make that happen ahead of time, that's ideally the best way to go. And when you talk about transportation planning and wildlife, so you're going to have a research and monitoring component no matter what, because you're going to know that there's some particular species that would potentially suffer from a roadway or whatever the infrastructure is. And so you want to research and monitor whether that's tracking the movement of the wildlife or using camera traps just to figure out what array of species you have moving in the area, things like that. And all of this transportation planning, the actual infrastructure, the research and monitoring can be very expensive. But in the long run, as opposed to paying for property damages, it's really hard to put a price tag on human life. And some of us feel strongly about wildlife as well. So we also have a hard time putting a value on wildlife. And so in the long term, these crossing structures save money, but they are very expensive up front, but they're very worthwhile and they last a very long time. And so another thing in the transportation planning, strong partnerships. These are not projects that get done with individual agencies alone. So you're always going to have the wildlife agencies involved, whether that's state, federal, both. You're going to have transportation departments like DOT. You're going to have conservation groups like the Wildlife Federation. So we are looking to be more and more heavily involved in some of these projects because we care about wildlife and we want to make a difference. Policymakers, you cannot avoid legislation in this because that's where a lot of the funding comes through. And then the public. You want the public to understand why this is important. You want them to understand why connectivity is important for conservation of species. And you want them to feel comfortable when they see a crossing structure, what that looks like, what that means, what's going on. And then, of course, I've got that last bullet again. Always, always, always. Federal and state funding. Funding is needed for these projects. And so that's something that I'll mention too when I get to a slide of what can we do support funding for these projects. And I did put this picture in here. This was from Fish and Wildlife Service. It's Red Wolf Crossing sign. It's down in the eastern part of the state. And I do want to say, unfortunately, 2 red wolves have been lost this year to vehicle wildlife collisions. And so this is a real issue, and it's one of those things that how can we prevent this from occurring, especially with a species that currently has fewer than 20 individuals in the wild. So it's definitely something that we need to keep working at and make some headway. Okay, so here's that slide. What can we do? So first and foremost, kind of changing our mindset. A lot of people tend to, we think about ourselves, we think about our daily routines, we think about what we need. But, you know, having that broader view about what are the environmental needs, what goes on around us, how do we fit into the landscape? And so first and foremost, maintaining natural areas for wildlife. This can be done through different ways: conservation easements, land acquisition. There are different programs that are offered to keep land in natural states. And so as much habitat as we can maintain, the better we're going to be, because that provides kind of like what we're talking about, these quote sidewalks or greenways for wildlife to move unimpeded across the landscape. So we would want to prioritize large contiguous areas, especially for unique habitat types. And we've talked about those. They're all different habitat types, but one that comes to mind a lot for me in North Carolina are like bogs, for example. That's a pretty unique habitat type, but it supports specific species in that habitat. And so we want to protect some of these tracts of land, and we also want to provide opportunities for connectivity and expansion of wildlife populations that exist in these areas. And we want to prioritize high biodiversity. So this could be flora or fauna. A lot of these areas will have threatened and endangered species, things like that. So if you have unique habitat types, you have high biodiversity, we want to conserve that for the future, because that is our future for generations to come. And so it's very important that we take the steps and actions now to make a difference. And then, of course, we have land with potential for habitat restoration or improvement. And we talked about suitable habitat. So there could be habitat out there that we could make some relatively minor management changes to and improve that habitat for specific species, for connectivity, things like that. So once again, what can we do? Just knowing what species are present. So I encourage all of you to know what species are around, to know what's native versus non-native, to know how to support species, to know how to interact or not interact with species, things like that. And then, of course, connecting these natural areas through systems of corridors, structures that will help them travel unobstructed, which will reduce roadway mortality. And so all the mortality events that are prevented, those are individuals that will stay within the population. And especially when you have reproductive age individuals, that can make a really big difference to a population. And advocate for funding. So that's something the Wildlife Federation is going to continue working on, advocating for funding, getting the word out to the public about the importance of this topic and what we can do, and basically come up with a strategic plan of how to kind of plan these projects in North Carolina. Who are the partners? What does that look like? And what appropriate funding is available? And so we will quickly go through a couple of these projects that the Wildlife Federation is involved in. So these are the underpasses on US 64. And I've got the logos here: Wildlife Federation, Wildlife Resources Commission, and DOT. And so I've got a picture here. This is in what some of you know is the 5-county area where red wolves are. But this is, so Highway 64, US 64 is going to be up there in the red. You can kind of see it going from Washington to Terrell County. And so right through there, going west of Columbia, there are actually some underpasses. And this project was completed a number of years ago in hopes of effectively moving wildlife underneath the roadway to prevent mortality. And so the way the Wildlife Federation has gotten involved is that when you put these crossing structures in and you have fencing and things like that we talked about, you have to have some level of maintenance. And so maintenance involves people going out, checking the fencing, making sure there aren't holes, making sure vegetation is cleared, things like that. And so we started a local chapter in Columbia, and I think this is in the works. So if any of you all know people in this area of the state, we would love to have them as part of this chapter. But they are looking for maintenance issues with fencing, and they put out camera traps to take pictures of the wildlife that are utilizing these underpasses, because no one really knew what was utilizing them, and we needed to find some way to maintain these. And so we thought this was a perfect project for our chapter. So our chapter is working with Wildlife Resources Commission and DOT. And here are just a few of the pictures real quick. And you'll see some of these photos are taken during the day and some are at night. And so these are just some of the different species. So we've got black bear, otter, you've got a little raccoon here, possibly got some fox, possibly a coyote, possibly a hybrid, but with a red wolf, it's hard to tell without some genetics work. But basically the premise is species are utilizing these underpasses, and this is really important to know what's going through here and what's happening across the landscape, because this is how we tell that these structures are effective. So you don't want to put structures out if you don't think they're going to be effective. And then when you can measure effectiveness through different means, and this would be looking at just the number of species traveling through, number of individuals, things like that, you can get a sense of how effective they are. So all of these individuals that are transversing this area are able to avoid traffic on the highway above. So pretty cool. And I wanted to briefly touch also on this project that the Wildlife Federation is involved in. And so this is called Safe Passage, the I-40 Pigeon River Gorge Wildlife Crossing Project. So we started working with this large collaborative group in 2017. So we've been doing this about 4 years. So this group is comprised of nearly 20 different federal agencies, state, tribal, NGOs. We've got all kinds of folks in there. We've got North Carolina DOT, Tennessee DOT, and all of this is working to take a stretch of I-40, 28 miles, 20 miles in North Carolina, 8 in Tennessee, and to make it safer for wildlife and humans. And so this is due to just a high number of wildlife vehicle collisions and mortalities on this roadway. So the species that we're looking at most are elk, black bear, and white-tailed deer. But anytime we make improvements for crossing structures, things like that in this area, we're also promoting it for smaller species as well. And so this is a picture of I-40 through the Pigeon River Gorge area. And so this goes back to that conversation we were talking about topography and how animals are funneled into certain areas. So there are going to be certain areas through here where we can take a look at mortality, hotspots, things like that. And a lot of that is based on topography and barriers. And we've got the website here. If any of you guys want to check it out, it's really cool. But the Wildlife Federation will continue to be part of this collaborative. And so some of the survey methods, and this is the Pigeon River Gorge study, and these pictures are both from Wildlands Network and National Parks Conservation Association. I can't say enough how fantastic they are at partnering on this, and they have actually been doing the on-the-ground collaring of elk for this project. So they're actually conducting the field work, and the Wildlife Federation is more involved on the advocacy side, the educational component, things like that. And so I asked them if I could put up a couple pictures of elk movement. So the one picture here, you can see with the different colors, the one that doesn't look like a ball of yarn, those are all different elk with different GPS units. And so you can kind of get an idea of some of the movement there. And part of that is based on topography and what the landscape is like. So you also want to look at the habitat that the elk are moving through. And elk tend to graze. And so there are probably open fields through there. There are probably some trails. So we wanted to get a better idea about, okay, where are the elk going? And how can we keep them from, risking their lives every time they're crossing a roadway? And so the first thing to do is track their movement. So you can kind of see different movements there. And then this other picture, I don't want you to focus too much on the detail, but it gives you an idea of the amount of movement and where these individuals are going and back and forth and traveling, and they're utilizing different areas. And with the GPS data, you can tease out time of day and what's actually happening. And one thing, when I've worked with research and wildlife in the past, one thing that this particular species working with elk, but I worked with species where if you had one individual that was collared, then you had quite a few individuals. So a number of these elk are probably moving in kind of smaller herds. So there may be 2 or 3 together. You may have a reproductive female with a calf or something like that moving around the landscape. So just because you have one individual collared animal that you're looking at does not mean that there aren't other animals with it as well. And so that's kind of important to remember. But so we wanted to get an idea of where the elk going and when and how. And so Wildlands Network, National Parks Conservation Association also put out a lot of camera traps because they wanted to see what species are utilizing the current structures and where do we need more structures to prevent them from wildlife from getting hit by vehicles. So you see this picture here, you've got an elk actually walking under an underpass, is actually on a roadway. And then you've got a bobcat coming out of a standard culvert. And so we've already got some wildlife utilizing these structures that have been here for years, but we've still got a mortality issue that we need to address. And so here are some more pictures from the camera traps. So here, I think these are really cool because you've got a bear here with the culvert tunnel, and chances are a bear will utilize that tunnel. And then in the other picture, you've got an elk that is more likely to not utilize a dark tunnel. They're more likely to go actually across the landscape like a natural land bridge here, or do what this elk is doing here, going through more open area. And so that goes back to those behavioral differences of species. And so with this project, the Wildlife Federation, we're heavily involved. We're very supportive of everything this collaborative group is doing. And we're looking forward to kind of the results of all the GPS data, the camera traps and everything that should be coming out hopefully this year. And then we'll be able to start kind of planning that mitigation. So where are the best places? Where are these mortality hotspots? Where are the best places for crossing structures? How do we get the funding together? Things like that. So very cool stuff. And then I wanted to throw this slide in here real quickly. This is the last slide before we go to Q&A, but I just wanted to talk about climate because climate affects wildlife. It affects resource needs, it affects movement, shift in habitat types. So when we have temperature changes or precipitation changes, things like that, you'll see a shift in habitat types. I mean, we're already seeing some shift on the coast with like a saltwater intrusion, things like that. So when you have habitats that change, these species that are dependent on specific habitats are also going to change or move if possible. And so ranges will move as well. Population numbers may move. You may have species that are readily adaptable to what we're going to see with climate change. And so you may see some population numbers of certain species increase, and then you may see a lot that also decrease. I think a lot of scientists are kind of waiting to see what this looks like, and not waiting, but it's kind of hard to know what things are going to look like and what species are going to adapt and what species are not. And then when we talk about climate and potential climate change, invasive species. So Chad mentioned that the chapter's been doing some projects or removing some invasive species. And so sometimes climate could make habitat more suitable for invasive species. So this is definitely a topic that we need to continue to consider when we talk about habitat fragmentation, connectivity, and what does that look like in the future as some of our climate does change. And then I wanted to note too, some species actually do become extinct before scientists identify or even learn about them. And I think a prime example of this are some of the insects. Sometimes there are species that truly, we just don't know about them. And they're important, though, for the context of biodiversity and maintaining these species for the future to have functional ecosystems. And so I just want to say climate can make proactive planning for habitat connectivity more critical. This is important, and especially just like North Carolina, as our population continues to grow, connectivity is and reducing fragmentation is already critically important, but then we also have these changes that we have to factor in, like climate. And so we will continue to work on these issues and see what we can do. And then I as the final slide. A lot of you know I'm from Western North Carolina, so I'm a mountain girl, mountain person. And this is the Lynn Cove Viaduct. This is it's up near Grandfather Mountain. And so this is an interesting example of infrastructure that is actually, it's still interacting with the landscape, but it's in a way that is less harmful than it could have been. So I think it's a really cool example to end here with a roadway. But I do want to make sure that we answer your questions and you have an opportunity to provide comments. So we'll go there.
Liz, this was amazing. This was such an extensive talk, so many details. This was just incredible. So I think we do have a few questions in the chat. John, if you'd like to just ask your question out loud, you can definitely go ahead and do that.
Let me get back to the questions. Wait, wrong one. And sorry for that blip before where I took control.
No worries.
It happens to all of us. Don't worry.
Technology can be crazy.
One question I had is there is in Congress, in the federal government, something called the Land and Water Conservation Fund, and that's always in the news in terms of how much budgeting it gets and whatever. But is that something that the Wildlife Federation or any of your sister organizations have tapped into to try to get more funding for these wildlife corridors?
So Land and Water Conservation Fund does a lot. It funds a lot of projects and all different types of projects. And it's something, it is legislation that the North Carolina Wildlife Federation has supported greatly and advocated for, and has been heavily involved in making sure that that's something that is renewed with dedicated funding and things like that. I think when you talk about crossing structures and roadways and everything, you're looking more towards transportation infrastructure packages. And there's actually some corridor connectivity legislation on the national level currently. And I think that that's one thing that in North Carolina, our organization, working with other organizations, we're going to start thinking about what these mechanisms look like on a state level for us. But I think a lot of that funding, when we talk about federal, will come from some of these large transportation packages. If that answers your question. And I did want to say, I just looked at the clock, and so I was a little bit long-winded with the presentation, so I hope we're still within the time frame. It's just, I get so excited about this topic.
It was a great presentation.
Okay.
And kind of in connection with that, another question I had was, we're probably hearing a lot every day about, this, President Biden wants to have an infrastructure, bill passed. Have any of the wildlife organizations tried to, give their input, or have they had an opportunity to give input in terms of money that might be available from that?
So I think these are great questions, and I do wish our policy staff person were sitting right here beside me, because he has a wealth of knowledge on these specific topics. But I think a broad scale infrastructure package, I'm sure there's a lot of funding in there that would trickle down for all different types of projects. But I am not exactly familiar if there's anything specific. And I think at this point, I know the Wildlife Federation, we strategically weigh in on specific pieces of legislation, and that is so that we can kind of campaign, for lack of a better word, like build a campaign around something that we know is important. So like this is an important issue. So this is something we would want to create public education around. We would want a bill with language that we could say, okay, this is what people need to know about. This is what our representatives need to know about so that they can make good decisions. So I wouldn't want to, I don't want to mislead you there. I think our conservation policy person could add more to that conversation. But that's really all that I can add at this point.
Thank you. That's a good answer.
You're hitting me with the hard questions. Yeah, I'm just kidding. It's all great.
John, did you have one more question? Do you collaborate with?
Yeah, the last question I had was when you work on these projects, I mean, there always seems to be a lot of, between conservation organizations and developers. I think there's always kind of a healthy friction there. And when you're working on some of the projects, do you ever try to maybe get the buy-in or collaborate, with developers?
That's not something we have done directly from the Wildlife Federation standpoint. We kind of utilize our resources to weigh in on the policy, the education part, advocating, because we're definitely, our interest lies in the wildlife and making sure that the research, the monitoring, the on the ground, that we have the right partners in the right places. And so I think direct interactions with developers, I think more of it revolves around the policy. I think we would always certainly be open to anyone who wants to have any kind of conversation about wildlife or connectivity or roadways or planting native species, pollinator habitat. But we currently do not have direct contacts with developers. But to say that, like WRC has a couple staff positions that work with DOT on a lot of the roadway planning and some of the infrastructure and the crossing projects. So Wildlife Resources Commission has been working on some crossing projects for a couple decades now in North Carolina. And so they have been very involved in these processes. And so they definitely deserve some credit for kind of initiating some of the crossing structures that already exist, especially like US 64 and stuff. And so I think some of those folks that are more involved in the design process, than the Wildlife Federation. It's kind of in some of these bigger partnerships, we kind of all play different roles, and the Wildlife Federation's a little bit different than that.
All right, thanks.
We have some more good questions. We have a question, are power line easements positive, negative, or neutral related to wildlife connectivity?
Interesting. So that's a great question. So those kind of easements and areas, a lot of those now are planted for pollinators and different habitat types, but a lot of species do utilize areas like that for movement. And, I've seen a lot of deer moving down power line openings. It provides, sight for them and they can move around easily. So I think once again, it depends on the species. But I do know that for pollinators and insects and stuff, there's a lot of promoting of wildlife in those areas.
Thanks, Liz. And we have a hand raised from Bob Toby, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yes. Liz, I'm in the western part of the state, and this safe passage thing, I-40 thing, really is exciting. I see that something might happen at that Harmondale area, maybe starting later this year. What is the outlook there for these perhaps 5 projects that might happen in the next 5 years along I-40 there?
So thank you for that question. That's fantastic. And that's something I didn't touch on too much just in the interest of time. But so there are bridge replacements that are going to be occurring, and Harmondale is one. I think Harmondale, as you mentioned, may be one of the first ones slated for repair. And what our collaborative group has been doing, we, with some other conservation groups, submitted some formal recommendations to DOT about how during that change of infrastructure, upgrading some of those bridges, how they could make those areas more wildlife friendly for crossings. And so DOT has been fantastic to work with on this project in the western part of the state. And they always have representatives at the collaborative meetings and stuff. But they are taking some of those recommendations into account and making some of those bridges, underpass areas under the bridges and everything more wildlife friendly. So that will be occurring over their timelines, come and go and change a little bit, but hopefully over the next, few years and stuff, we'll start to see what some of those look like and maybe be able to have our partners maybe have some cameras or something to kind of assess some of the effectiveness there. So that's what's occurring.
Okay, thanks.
Great. We just have a few more questions, so we'll try to get to all 5 of these really, really quickly. So the next question is from Bill, and have the animals been seen walking down the road shoulders before trying to cross over? How is this activity being addressed to reduce exposure?
So I think that's one thing. What we talked about, where you do have a crossing structure, that's one role that the fencing plays, so that if you do have animals that are walking down the sides of roads, they're going to be funneled into the structures. If you have animals kind of on the roadways where you don't have fencing or a crossing structure, things like that, it's something to take note of and to realize that there's some reason why the wildlife are crossing or attempting to cross in those areas. And it's the same thing. I'm sure you guys have probably been in the same situation I've been in. You're driving down the roadway and you have a squirrel that runs one way and then runs back the other way and back, and you're trying your best to avoid this and everything. And so I think that sometimes these situations happen very quickly. And what we want to do is just put these crossing structures in the best place, put the fencing up that's appropriate. And I will say different species require different fencing structures, because obviously small species can get through some, and bears are, and sometimes it's hard to find some fencing that can keep a bear from taking part of it down, things like that. But yeah, so it's really just a matter of mitigation. So I think anytime you take note of things like that, especially species on the side of roadways, just slow down as much as you can and give them, a wide berth and hope for the best. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Liz. It would be great if NCWF could work with NCDOT to plant wildflowers along state roadways and highways. And this was a statement, but kind of a question too, to be like, can we do this?
Yeah, and that's actually, we have 2 great people on this call from the Wildlife Federation, one being Tara and one being Madison, who work with a lot of the pollinator and the trees for trash work. And I think that's something that's been an evolving conversation with DOT about how to support pollinator habitat along roadways. It's one of those things where it will bring pollinators toward roadways. It's kind of, if you build it, they will come. It's kind of like if you put milkweed in your yard, at some point you're likely to see monarch caterpillars and stuff. And so it would be an effective place for utilizing some of these native species. But I do think we have a couple staff people who might want to add a sentence or two, because that's more in their realm. Any thoughts there, or is that good to cover it?
I think you covered it pretty well, Liz.
All right.
I think so as
Yeah.
well. I've also read that NCDOT has typically refrained from adding pollinator habitat because of that more increased mortality. But there's also programs that NCDOT could enroll in where they have a little bit more flexibility about where they put that habitat. So I can send you, Donna, a little bit more information about that.
So that was your expert answer. So take that one from Madison.
Awesome. Thank you, Madison and Liz. We have a question. Based on your research, will a moving animal know the difference between the safe route and the dangerous one?
Okay, so I think with that question, the best I could answer is possibly based on experience. Some animals learn to avoid certain areas, and you can assume that's because they've either had a bad experience or they, for some reason, sense some sense of danger with crossing and things like that. And just like if an animal chooses to try to cross a road in a time that's less busy than other times or something. So there probably is some sort of sensory mechanism that's going on there that helps them to a certain extent. But I think, yeah, I'll leave that up to the individual species scientist.
Sounds good, Liz. Thank you. And we just have one more minute, so we're going to try to get to these last two really quickly. Do you know if the elk introduced in 2001-2002 was tagged? How was the study group selected for callers? Had they already dispersed and established territories?
Okay, so we'll take
the abbreviated answer, yeah.
Or I'll do a quick general answer. So elk were reintroduced to Western North Carolina, and so with any kind of reintroduction program like that, especially of such a large-bodied species, so I think it's something that's well managed, well tracked, and of course the state agency Wildlife Resources Commission is heavily involved in that from day one. And so there's probably, they probably have a lot of information on the elk populations in North Carolina for quite some time. And I believe now there's somewhere between 200 and 250 is the current estimate for Western North Carolina. And as far as the study here that I kind of introduced to you guys with GPS and the camera traps, Wildlands Network was working with National Parks Conservation Association, Great Smoky Mountains National Park, those folks, their staff, to kind of get some of these collars out on the elk. Wildlife Resources Commission has some elk out that are being tracked as well. And so there's a lot of data being collected in that realm. I'm not sure if I hit all those questions that you had, but you can always contact us directly too. And if we don't have the answer, we will find the agency or the person who does.
Perfect. Thanks, Liz. You did a great job there with covering those. And I'm gonna connect you and Marcy because she had a question as well, but we are out of time here. So I have you guys in an email chain right now. And thank you for the comment there, John. If you didn't see that, Liz, you might want to check that out in the chat box, but I'll turn it right back over to Chad.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Liz. That was a great presentation on a very, very important issue that we're having, and Tara for monitoring or just doing our webinar here. But a couple things right quick. Liz, does the legislature, or are there any champions in the legislature today, or where does Governor Cooper stand on this as far as getting more funding and promoting this the wildlife connections?
So I think to speak to that a little bit, there are some what I would consider kind of what you're saying, champions on the federal level where some of this has already been introduced. As far as the state level, I think that's something that NCWF is going to be working on a strategy and trying to get a feel for, where some of our state folks stand on some of these issues and topics. A lot of this goes hand in hand with some of the climate and, restoration, things like that. And so I think we'll be gauging that in the future. But as far as current how people feel one way or another. I couldn't answer that for you tonight.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And just one other note, our meetings are, I think I forgot to mention, are the second Thursday of each month, and they're at 7 p.m. So just put those on your calendar, and we're going to have some more great speakers. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, bye everyone. Have a great night.
All right,
Thank
thank you.
you.
Great.